Mother of the groom publicly shames bride's mom at wedding. There are moments in life that fracture quietly, not with a scream, not with shattering glass, but with a subtle shift in air pressure. A silence too perfect, a breath held too long. For Emma Tran, that moment came on the afternoon she was supposed to get married. It was late spring in Maple Creek, Georgia, and the vineyard had been transformed into something close to a dream. Fairy lights strung between dogwoods, white linen tablecloths fluttering like sails in the breeze, mason jars filled with peonies and baby's breath. From a distance, it looked like a magazine cover. Up close, it was more fragile than it seemed. Inside the bridal cottage, Emma sat in front of the mirror, unmoving. Her hair had been curled into soft waves, her eyes lined with brown and gold, her lips touched with a shade called dusty rose. Her dress was beautiful, not extravagant, just simple lace and ivory silk pack, the kind that whispered elegance rather than screamed it. She looked like a bride. She did not feel like one. From the open window, she could hear the guests mingling. Laughter, glasses clinking, the clatter of silverware. Beneath all of that, the unmistakable cadence of Margaret Walker's voice. Low, polished, southern, cutting through the spring air like a blade under silk. She's polite, I'll give her that. But honestly, what kind of girl doesn't know who her father is? And that mother. Did you see what she wore? Looks like she walked out of a clearance rack. Emma didn't move. She didn't cry. She simply folded her hands in her lap and stared at her reflection like it belonged to someone else. Her mother, Lynn Tran, had chosen a lavender dress. No makeup, just her usual lip balm. Her shoes were 10 years old but polished. She had stitched a small crane into the hem of Emma's wedding dress the night before. Just a detail. Something to remind her that love, when folded carefully, could hold shape even under pressure. Lynn had raised Emma alone. She never said much about Emma's father, only that he was a young man in uniform, that they had loved briefly, and that life, like war, did not always return what it took. Emma had never asked for more. Until now. She stood up and walked out of the cottage, her gown trailing behind her like mist on a river. She found her mother standing near the ceremony arch, adjusting the placement of white roses that had begun to wilt in the heat. "Did she say it to you?" Emma asked quietly. Lynn looked up, her eyes tired but calm. "Not directly." Emma exhaled. "But she meant you." Lynn nodded once. There was no rage, no panic, only the weight of familiarity, a humiliation too old to feel fresh, too precise to be accidental. Back in the tent, the band had stopped playing. Margaret had taken the microphone, smiling like a politician addressing donors. "We are so thrilled to welcome Emma into our family," she said. "It's not every day that someone from, well, humbler beginnings finds her way to something better." There were murmurs of laughter. Polite, uncomfortable. Emma heard it from just outside. She didn't wait. She walked calmly to the center of the tent, her heels clicking like punctuation marks. The crowd turned. Conversations stalled. Margaret turned and froze. Emma took the second microphone, her voice steady. "This is my wedding day," she said, not loud, not angry, just certain. "And I won't let it be a stage for cruelty dressed as courtesy." Gasps flickered like match flames. "My mother has raised me with nothing but dignity, grace, and strength. She worked 12-hour shifts in a tailor shop to pay for my textbooks. She never asked for help. And she never once taught me to shame someone who had less than I did." Emma's gaze moved to Margaret. "If that doesn't fit your idea of family, that's your burden, not mine." Margaret's face twitched, her smile tightening. "Well," she said into her mic, "perhaps if we knew who your father was, we'd better understand your temperament." The word temperament landed like a stone. There was a pause. A moment so sharp and cold it sliced through the room. Lynn didn't speak. She turned, as if to disappear, but Emma reached for her hand, held it tight, and that was when James, the groom, stepped forward. His suit slightly wrinkled, tie loosened, face ashen. "Mom," he said, quietly but firmly. "Enough." Margaret's jaw locked. "James, No," he said, "you don't get to do this. Not to her, not to me, not today." The room held its breath. Someone, somewhere, was filming. But no one stopped them. Some things, when they break, need witnesses. James turned to Emma. "I'm sorry." Emma nodded. And for a moment, the two of them stood in the center of the storm, holding each other steady. Then she stepped away, took her mother's hand again, and together they walked out, not defeated, but defiant. Outside, the wind picked up. The white roses shook on their stems. A paper crane, stitched beneath silk, held its fold. Something had broken, but something else, something harder to name, had begun. He hadn't looked at the photo in years. It was tucked away inside a manila folder, inside a drawer he rarely opened, inside a desk that had long since become a storage unit for a life he no longer lived. But now, the photo lay on the kitchen table beneath the soft glow of a morning sun that had no business feeling this gentle. Thomas Grant stared at the image. He looked young in it. 27, maybe. Uniform crisp. Eyes alive. His arm wrapped around a woman in a floral blouse, her head tilted slightly toward his shoulder. She wasn't smiling at the camera. She was looking at him. Lynn. That was her name. That was her face. And somehow, impossibly, she was back. He had seen her 2 nights ago. Not in person, but in a viral video that had passed through his social feed like static, like wind through a half-open window. He hadn't clicked on it at first. He didn't care for weddings. He didn't linger on internet drama. But the still frame caught something. A woman in lavender, standing beside a young bride. There had been something about her posture, the way she stood behind her daughter like a wall, like a prayer. So he clicked, and in 68 seconds, the weight of 25 years shifted. The bride's name was Emma Tran, and though she didn't know it yet, she was his daughter. He had been stationed in Georgia back in '98, Fort Stewart. Just 6 months before his first overseas deployment, he had walked into a tailor shop with a torn sleeve and come out with a name he couldn't forget and a feeling he didn't have a name for. Lynn didn't flirt. She didn't linger. But she listened. And he, full of uniform and bravado, found himself returning with excuses that got thinner and thinner until all that was left was honesty. They had 2 months. Maybe less. A handful of evenings. One stormy Sunday afternoon that he still dreamed about. Then came the orders. He was being shipped to Kabul. He left with a promise to write. But the war, like most wars, stole time, stole intention, and stole silence. Letters came late, or didn't come at all. By the time he returned to the States, her shop had closed. Her name was no longer in the phone book, and Thomas, not knowing how to begin again, never did. Now he stood in his kitchen in Alexandria, Virginia, his silver hair damp from the shower, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the phone. "Wallace," he said when the familiar voice answered. "I need a flight to Georgia." There was a pause. "Sir, may I ask?" "No," he said, then gentler, "Not yet." He packed a single bag, just one, a suit, the photo, and a letter he hadn't written yet. He didn't tell his sister. He didn't call his commanding officer. He didn't even cancel his appointments. He just left. Because sometimes when the past finds you, the only answer is to meet it halfway. In Maple Creek, Emma sat at her mother's dining table, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She hadn't spoken much since the wedding. Neither had Lynn. Words felt like too much and not enough, all at once. Outside, the sun filtered through lace curtains. The world, somehow, kept moving. "I want to know," Emma said at last. Lynn looked up from her sewing, a patch of fabric still folded in her lap. "Know what?" Emma met her eyes. "About my father." Lynn didn't move, but something behind her gaze shifted, like a door unlocking, just barely. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to build a ghost," she said. "I didn't want you to grow up chasing someone who couldn't be caught." "Then let me decide that now," Emma said. "Let me know his name." Lynn nodded once. "His name was Thomas Grant." Emma whispered it once under her breath, as if trying it on. It didn't fit. Not yet. The doorbell rang. They both turned. Lynn stood slowly, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. She opened the door, and there he was. A man, late 50s, suit pressed but weary, eyes rimmed in red, holding a small leather-bound folder against his chest like a confession. He didn't smile. He simply said, "Lynn." Her hand flew to her mouth. Emma stepped into the hallway, barefoot, her breath catching. The man turned, looked at her, not like a stranger looks, like someone trying to remember the shape of something he once believed in. "Emma," he said, and then he whispered, "I'm your father." The vineyard looked different the second time around. Not in its appearance. The fairy lights still hung like halos in the branches, the white chairs still aligned in careful rows, the tables reset with fresh linens and flowers. But something in the air had changed. as if the ground itself knew that what had unraveled here could not be swept beneath a rug or tucked into a scrapbook. It was the second attempt at a wedding reception. A do-over, people joked. A reset. But no one laughed too loudly. Because everyone had seen the video. They had seen Emma stand tall in a storm of veiled insults. They had heard her voice break and then strengthen, and they had watched a man, unknown, unannounced, arrive in a car with government plates and silver hair, looking like history walking in from the edge of the frame. That man stood now at the edge of the reception tent, his hands folded, his posture straight out of habit, not pride. Thomas Grant had not come to be applauded. He had come to speak. Emma stood just inside the tent, her fingers grazing the edge of a wine glass. Her mother sat beside her, quiet. The woman who had never asked for recognition, never demanded a seat at the table. People watched them now with a strange reverence, as if realizing too late they'd misunderstood the story. James walked up and touched Emma's back. "You ready for this?" he asked. "No," she said softly, "but I'm done hiding from it." He smiled. "That's why I married you." She gave him a look. "We're not married yet." He winked. "Details." When Thomas stepped onto the stage, the tent fell silent. Not the hush of politeness, the silence of a page turning, of something beginning. He didn't take the microphone right away. He looked out at the faces, some curious, some skeptical, some already moved. Then he spoke. "My name is Thomas Grant. I served in the United States Army for 30 years. I've stood in war zones, sat in rooms where peace was negotiated in fragile pieces. But I've never been more afraid to speak than I am right now." He paused. "Because this isn't about service or rank or history. It's about something I left undone." He turned slightly, his eyes finding Lynn. 25 years ago, I met a woman who changed me. Not with loud gestures or declarations, but with kindness. With quiet, deliberate love. Her name was Lynn Tran, and I left her behind, not knowing what I left. He turned again, and this time his voice dropped. She had a child, my child, and I didn't know. Not until last week. Now his eyes found Emma. She stood on this stage, not to defend herself, but to defend her mother, and in doing so, she reminded me of what I forgot, that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in sacrifice, in dignity, in staying. Emma didn't blink. Thomas continued. "I came here today not to rewrite history. I can't, but I came to tell the truth, to say Emma Tran is my daughter, and I am proud of her, not because she's mine, but because of the woman she became without me." Silence, no clapping, no music, just breath. Then, a voice from the audience. "Margaret, are we supposed to believe this?" Her voice cut sharp like it always had. "Some man shows up in a suit, says a few nice words, and suddenly everything's forgiven?" She stood now, her dress pressed, her expression unreadable. "This isn't some fairy tale." Thomas didn't flinch. "No," he said, "it's not. It's a truth 25 years late, but it's still true." Margaret scoffed. "People like her, they make up stories all the time. To feel special." Emma stepped forward then, calm, strong. "My mother never asked to be special. She just wanted me to be okay. And she made that happen. Without help, without pity, without you." Margaret opened her mouth again, but James had moved to her side now. "Mom," he said, with the same steel in his voice Emma had used days earlier. "Sit down." She hesitated, and then for the first time in a long time, she did as she was told. Later, when the music returned, it played softer than before, a different tempo, a different rhythm. Thomas approached Emma beneath the canopy of lights. "I don't expect you to call me Dad," he said. "I won't," she replied gently. He nodded. "That's fair. But," she added, "I might call you family, someday." He looked away, just for a second, because even soldiers are allowed to cry. Then he said, "I'll wait." Across the vineyard, Lynn stood watching them, her hands folded, her face unreadable, not because she felt nothing, but because she finally didn't need to explain herself to anyone. For the first time in years, silence was not a burden. It was peace. She sat at the edge of the vineyard, beneath an old dogwood tree that had shed half its blossoms. Margaret Walker wasn't used to being overlooked. She had built a life out of being seen, fundraisers, political dinners, alumni galas. She always knew where to stand for the camera, when to nod, how to laugh politely but not too loudly. But tonight, she wasn't in any of the photos. She watched them from a distance. Emma, James, Lynn, even Thomas. Orbiting around each other now, like pieces of a puzzle that somehow still fit, even after being bent and left in a drawer for decades. Margaret was the one left out of the frame. She sipped her champagne, now flat and lukewarm, and felt the sharp sting of something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Shame. Not because she'd been caught. Because she had finally heard herself, through Emma's voice, through the echo of the silence that had followed her words on that stage. She had meant to protect her son. Instead, she had humiliated his future. It was Lynn who approached first. Not with accusation, not even with anger, just with a cup of warm tea. Margaret looked up, startled. "You didn't have to." "I know," Lynn said softly, "but I did anyway." She sat beside her, hands wrapped around her own cup, the steam curled between them like breath in winter. They sat that way for a long moment. No one spoke. The wind rustled through the vineyard, making the paper lanterns sway. Then Margaret said, "I'm not used to being wrong." Lynn gave the faintest smile. "That doesn't mean you never are." Margaret let out a short laugh. "Touché." She looked down at her hands, at her manicured nails, trembling slightly. "I judged you," she said. "Both of you. I looked at your clothes, your background, the way you carried yourself, and I thought I knew the whole story. I thought I was better. And when I couldn't control the narrative, I punished you for it." She swallowed. Her voice cracked. "I was cruel." Lynn nodded. "Yes, you were." Margaret closed her eyes. "But," Lynn added, "you're here now. That matters." Margaret turned to her. "Why are you being kind to me?" Lynn looked back toward the tent where Emma stood laughing with Thomas and James, the lantern light catching in her hair. "Because she is," Lynn said, "and she got it from me." Margaret blinked, then laughed, quietly. The kind of laugh that says, "I deserve that." Later that evening, when the music slowed and the guests drifted toward the last slices of cake and final sips of wine, Margaret stepped onto the small wooden stage. No microphone this time. She didn't need one. People noticed. The volume dimmed, conversations paused, forks lowered. Emma looked up from her place at the head table. Lynn beside her. James, alert now as if ready to shield. Margaret spoke simply, "I owe this room an apology." No one interrupted. She turned to Lynn. "To you, for looking at you and seeing only what I didn't understand." To Emma. "To you for thinking I knew your worth by what was missing from your history instead of what you had built from it." To James. "To my son, for forgetting that love is not a performance, it is a promise." She breathed in. "I was wrong. Deeply. And I hope with time, I can be something better than who I was that night." Then, before anyone could respond, she stepped down. Not to applause, not to fanfare, just to quiet. And that, for the first time, was enough. Outside, beneath the string lights, Emma caught up to her. They stood in the open night, the sky full of stars and not a single flashbulb. "Thank you," Emma said. Margaret nodded. "I'm sorry it took this long." Emma looked at her. "Me too." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But something loosened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The guests had mostly gone home. The chairs were stacked now, the fairy lights dimmed to a soft golden whisper. The vineyard, once buzzing with celebration and ceremony, had settled into something quieter. More honest. Just a few remained. Emma sat on the steps of the old farmhouse porch, her feet bare, her dress loose around her knees, curls fallen from their pins. She wasn't tired. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Like finishing a long book you didn't know you were writing. She watched her mother move slowly through the clearing, collecting napkins left behind, folding them with the same care she folded dreams into fabric for years. And nearby, Thomas stood with a paper cup of coffee, long gone cold, watching Lynn the way a man watches something he never believed he'd see again. James joined her on the porch. He didn't speak. Just sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. She leaned into him slightly, a quiet gesture, the kind that spoke of things already understood. "I used to think weddings were supposed to be perfect," she said, staring out at the darkening hills. James smiled. "And now?" "Now I think they should be true." They sat like that for a while, not as newlyweds, not as survivors, but as two people who had earned something more difficult, more beautiful. Clarity. "Now I think they should be true." Later, in the soft hours between midnight and morning, Lynn sat with Thomas beneath the dogwood tree, the one where Margaret had once sat alone. They didn't speak of the past. Not directly. Lynn didn't ask where he'd been, and Thomas didn't offer apologies she hadn't asked for. Instead, he said, "She's remarkable." "She is," Lynn replied. "She always was." "You raised her on your own." "I didn't think I had a choice," Lynn said, then smiled. "But it turns out I did. I just chose her." Thomas looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry I wasn't there." "You are now," Lynn said, and it wasn't absolution, but it was enough. Inside, Emma and Margaret stood in the kitchen alone. Margaret had come in to help with the leftover cake. It was awkward at first, two women moving around each other like old dancers who had forgotten the steps. Then Margaret said without turning, "Your mother? She's extraordinary." Emma looked at her. "I know." A pause. Then Margaret added, "You are too." Emma blinked. "That might be the kindest thing you've ever said to me." Margaret glanced at her. "I'm trying. I don't know what it looks like yet, but I'm trying." Emma didn't respond, but when Margaret offered her a piece of cake, Emma took it. And that, somehow, was enough for now. The last scene was not dramatic. No grand speeches, no fireworks. Just Emma, James, Lynn, and Thomas standing outside the farmhouse, watching the stars blink into the sky. A family. Not perfect, but chosen. Emma looked at them, all of them, and realized something she hadn't dared believe until now. She didn't have to carry the past to protect it. She could let go. She could love without fear. And as the wind passed through the vines, soft and steady, she whispered the truth aloud, for herself more than anyone else. This is what family looks like. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely, undeniably, home.